Binti Hamza, and my group will be presenting the Old English era of poetry between the year 450 to 1066. These are my group members, Siti Nur Faezah and Syaidatul Nadrah. We are from class 2C. We're gonna be talking about two poems, its origin, its importance, and some of the literary devices we found in those two poems from the era, which are The Wanderer and The Seafarer. Without further ado, let's get into it.
So, I will be talking about the historical background of this era. So, before this era started, the Britain was actually invaded by the Romans from the 50th until the 410 Common Era. So, the Roman fort settlements, mainly Roman soldiers who came via invasion, was coexisting with Celtic Britons, which was the indigenous people, the native tribes of Britain at the time. But at some point, the Romans actually had to withdraw troops as Italy was under attack by Germanic invaders. So at the time, the Celtics, they decided, this might be their chance to chase out the Romans for good. So they asked assistance from the Anglo-Saxons. So the Anglo-Saxons are actually the external tribes at the time. They resided in the Germanic region. So yeah, the Anglo-Saxons did help the Celts. They built forts and stuff and helped the Celts. But at some point, when the Roman Empire fell, the Anglo-Saxons took their chance. So they invaded Britain instead and ruled for over 600 years. So yeah, the Germanic people migrated from the Northern Europe to Britain. So you might think, they must be filling in where the Romans settled in. Yeah? Well, yeah, but they also chased out the Celts. Well, not all, but some Celts had to move to parts such as Wales, Cornwall, Ireland, and Scotland. So this is where the Old English era started. Basically, this is why Old English is often called Anglo-Saxon language. Mainly because the Anglo-Saxons actually formed the basis of English culture, English religion, as well as the English language. So yeah. So next up is Old Literature. As I've mentioned before, Britain was actually invaded by the Romans. So the Romans introduced drama to them. It was a form of entertainment back then, and it actually expanded literary possibilities to Britain. And what started off as brief scenes illustrating the Bible stories later developed into Greek and Latin drama. So here is pictures of the Roman amphitheaters. As you can see, the one above is the one slightly above is Roman amphitheaters illustrated, and the second one is actually a Roman amphitheater in England, specifically in South Wales. This is called Caerleon Amphitheatre, also known as Isca Augusta or Isca Silurium. So next up is the types of literature in Old English, which is poetry and prose. As you know, poetry is mainly about poems, and prose is basically manuscripts written during this era. And now is the types of poetry in Old English. So first up, we have the main poetry that was written, that was used a lot in this era, which is epic, a heroic poetry which celebrates ancient and contemporary warriors, but it also celebrates acts of self-sacrifice and stories of brave women. And this type of poetry also combines pagan and Christian values. So epic is one of the major genres of poetry in this era. But other than that, we also have other types of poetry, which is elegy, a poem of sadness and mourning of the dead. And then we have ballad, an entertainment in the form of songs. And then we have idyll, a poem about a particular personality, which can be a source of inspiration, basically a poem to inspire people. So yeah. So next up is we have a visualization of the Mead Hall. So what is the Mead Hall? The Mead Hall is actually the king's residence as well as the king's court. It is also a venue used for public communal festivities, but what does that have to do with this presentation? So the Mead Hall is actually a major settings in Anglo-Saxon literature. So you can see traces of Mead Hall in poems such as The Dream of the Rood and others as well. So next up we have pioneers in Old English. So the thing about this era, a particular thing about this era, is that anonymity is very common in Old English literature. Some pieces have titles, some don't, some have anonymous authors, some don't, and most of the time they don't have both. So yeah, but despite that, we do have some names. So we have notable authors such as Aldham with his work The Lord Visitatis, which mainly talks about the saints in Latin, and then we have Kidmont with his hymn, also known as the most complicated historical text in Anglo-Saxon literature, and then we have Kenwolf with popular works such as The Fates of Apostles and Dream of the Rood. And then we have Alfred, or King Alfred, mostly translating Latin works such as the Pastor's Book. So now is Anglo-Saxon religion. So the Anglo-Saxons actually are pagan, which is basically worshipping different gods from what the majority does. So yeah, the Anglo-Saxon believed in pagan, they had firm beliefs in fate, or at the time was pronounced as weird, which is kind of ironic how weird today means uncanny. So yeah, the Anglo-Saxons worship different Germanic gods. I won't delve much into it, but as you can see here, I believe days of worship for the Anglo-Saxons actually influence in the name of days of the week that we use today. So as you can see, Thursday became Tuesday, Wednesday became Wednesday, and Thursday became Friday. So next up is Christianization of Anglo-Saxon. So this happened with the arrival of St. Augustine and Pope Gregory. So these two figures actually came and spread Christianity to Britain in 597 AD. During their friendly visits. But what actually moved the Anglo-Saxons to accept Christianity is when King Ethelbert of Kent converted to Christian. So what does this have to do with literature? It actually has a lot to do with it. So only then the church was established. So when the church was established, the church actually introduced a lot of things such as the ethos of peace, education, but the most important here was written literature. So they have monks write down pieces said by bards as well as rhapsods at the time. So yeah, this was a huge shift for literature because Anglo-Saxon before only, it's not really only, but they mainly have literature in the form of oral, but now with the establishment of the church, they now have written literature. So yeah, but I think the most renowned textual during this era was probably the law code of King Ethelbert. So when talking about Old English literature, we can't really move on without mentioning Beowulf. So I won't delve much into this, but Beowulf is actually the longest epic poem we have, which is around 3,000 lines long. So yeah, in the next slide, there will be a video of a man reciting the first opening lines of Beowulf in Old English, which is very much different from the English that we speak today.
Quat we gar dana in yar dagum feud kuninga thrim ye frunan hutha athalingus ellen fremidon.
So yeah, hello. The first poem that our group decided to present is The Wonder. The poem Wonder is the lament of a man who has lost his Lord and now journeys alone and friendless in the search of a new Lord. In sleep he dreams the days of his former happiness, but awaking he finds nothing but grey waves and falling snow, which adds to his distress. Then he passes on to reflect that the vicissitudes of fortune befall even the lords, and that misery is the common lot of men. The Wonder attains the height of great lyrical poetry, which expresses not only what is personal, but what is universal. The poem ends with a conventional Christian sentiment that good is the man who does not lose his faith in God. And now, themes for this poem is suffering, loneliness, and religion.
Now, for this poem's rhyme scheme, I've analyzed it, and there's no rhyme scheme or metrical pattern in the translation. The translator attempted to maintain these stanzas the same length in this version. Most of them have 4 to 5 lines. Now, moving on to the tone of this poem. The Wonder has a sad tone that is typical of Anglo-Saxon poetry. The poem is dominated by a hostile impression of nature, a feeling of loss and desire, loneliness, and a general gloomy perspective of the universe. The first one is nature as harsh and dangerous. The Wonder portrays nature as harsh and cold, dangerous and hostile to humans. The background for Anglo-Saxon poetry is the cold, gloomy European north of the Middle Ages, where winter was long and cool, summer was brief and unpredictable, and sunshine was few. Storms, cold, sickness, conflict, bloodshed, and wild animals all posed threats to the communities that lived there. As a result, the picture of the natural world in most Anglo-Saxon poetry generates a feeling of fear and melancholy rather than serenity or joy. The narrator in The Wonder describes the water as ice cold with frozen waves. In addition, he cites cold, snow, and hail. The picture emerges of a shivering, solitary figure huddled against the cold and guiding his fragile boat through the damp, bitter chill and driving sleet of the northern sea. The second one, loneliness. Loneliness is a dominant subject in The Wonder, and it intensifies the poem's melancholy tone. The narrator has lost his family, friends, lord, house, and social standing. He now faces the potential of remaining a lonely exile for the rest of his life. His situation is similar to that of many Anglo-Saxon soldiers who lost their liege lords in battle. All economic and geographic stability, personal and social identity, safety, and economic growth in a society based on the link between a lord and his sworn liegemen came through the connection to the lord and the mead hall, where he and his men would assemble to rejoice together. The Wanderer has also lost his family, friends, and home, most likely in the conflict that murdered his lord. And the third one is grim worldview. Before the arrival of Christianity, Anglo-Saxon culture and religion were distinctively grim and depressing. The Wanderer highlights how the poem's Christian components counter this sense of inevitability, presenting the prospect of paradise as the prize for surrender. However, the overall perception of the world as a dark and unfriendly place endures. Permanency exists only in heaven, and all joys are ephemeral in this life. I've analyzed several examples of metaphor in this poem. For example, line 3 to 4, the speaker uses a metaphor of the lone dweller stirring the rime cold, frost-cold sea with his hands to convey the idea that he is rowing a boat. This metaphor emphasizes how much the exile is at the mercy of the elements, since it's like he's a body being tossed about on the cold waves without even a boat to protect him. That line goes, across the series, long time must stir with his hands the realm cold sea. Now for line 13 to 14, noble strength to bind, foster spirit, guard his wealth chamber, think what he will. Line 13. The speaker uses the metaphor of binding the spirit to express the idea of keeping one's thoughts to oneself. This metaphor figures the spirit, a metonymy, for thoughts as a separate entity from the speaker and one that seeks to evade containment. Line 14. The speaker expresses the same idea with the metaphor of guarding the wealth chamber. This metaphor portrays thoughts as precious commodities that the owner must protect by hiding.
Now, let us look at the poetic sound devices. There are 3 poetic sound devices in this poem. The first one is alliteration, the second one is assonance, the third one is the consonance. For alliteration, there are 3 examples in this poem. The first example is in line 5. The way of the world, an open book always. The alliteration here is the repetition of the letter W in the beginning of the word way and the word world. The second example is in line 10, to whom I dare mumble my mind's understanding. The alliteration here is the repetition of the letter M in front of the word mumble, mind, and mind. And the last example is in line 14, hold on to the horse, think whatever. The alliteration here is the repetition of the letter H in front of the word hold and horse. Next, assonance. There are 3 examples of assonance in this poem. The first example is in line 1, how often the lone dweller anticipates. The assonance here is the repetition of the vowel sound O. The second example is in line 5. How many long whiles treading the tracks of exile. The assonance here is the repetition of the letter I. The last example is in line 6. So spoke the earth stepper, a memorial of miseries. The repetition of the letter E is the assonance in line 6. Lastly, consonants. There are also 3 examples of consonants in this poem. The first example is in line 3, mind carrying along the ocean's windings. The repetition of letter N is the consonants in this example. The second one is in line 4, steering rhyme chill seas, hands as oars. The repetition of the letter S is the consonants in this example. Line 14, for anyone to bind fast their spirits close. The repetition of the letter T is the consonants in this line. Next, let us take a look at symbol and symbolism. The first symbol in this poem is crumbling of kinsmen. It symbolizes the vagabond that contemplating the difficulties the poet needs to endure after the slaughter of his lord and relatives in a battle. The second symbol is the wanderer. It symbolizes that the poet is alone and a single man. Next is exile. It symbolizes the life of a warrior who is expelled from his native country and forced to live a life far away from his homeland. The poet also describes how unpleasant life far from home feels like. And the last symbol is lone dweller. It symbolizes that the poet is a solitary figure and he expects leniency from God and great courtesy, regardless destiny. Lastly, let us take a look at the form and structure. The unknown writer of The Wanderer utilizes a few fascinating literary devices that are as yet perceivable regardless of the huge contrast between Old English and present-day English. These include alliteration, enchantment, and caesura. The poem The Wanderer is a sonnet poem and it consists of 153 lines. Its translated version in modern English only reached 116 lines. The lines are alliterative, meaning that rhythm is based on the repetition of consonant sounds at the beginning of words. No rhyme scheme is found in this poem. No metrical example perceivable in the translation. In this translation, the translator tries to keep the translation to refrain a similar length line. Mostly, there are 4 to 5 lines in length. Casual stop were significant piece of Anglo-Saxon verse. Regularly, the lines were halted halfway through and got later on. For instance, the 10th line of the sonnet peruses, "Bewail my cares. There's now no one sleeping." Enjambment is another significant conventional gadget, one that is worried about the way the lines change. On the off chance that a line is cut off before the characteristic finish of the sentence or expression, it is a likely enjamb. For instance, the progress between line 3 and 4 must always mind carrying along the ocean's winding. The next example is in line 6 and line 7, many long whiles treading the tracks of exile, the way of the world, an open book always.
So hi, it's me again. So our second poem is The Seafarer, and I'll talk about what this poem is about and the themes for this poem. Throughout the poem, the speaker explores his life as a seafarer and the significant ups and downs of the profession. He expresses the misery of the cold days at sea, the loneliness, and the fear of danger. While sailing, he describes how he often misses the sounds and company of his friends. He has to make do with the sound of seabirds flying around his vessel. But despite the terrible times he often has, he takes pleasure from traveling. There's something in his soul or spirit that encourages him to set off and experience the world in a way that others don't. So in the end, the speaker turns to think about what happens after death and the unimportance of possessions. So the theme for The Seafarer is nature, suffering, and spirituality.
Now for the second poem, The Seafarer. According to the American poet and critic in the 10th century, who translated this poem, Ezra Pound, it is impossible to derive any sense of nature or rhyme scheme from The Seafarer in his translation. However, there are several examples of alliteration scattered throughout The Seafarer, such as Chinese Star in line 2. There are almost examples in every line of this poem. This helps to create a feeling of rhyme and rhythm without it being present in this text. The story of the seafarer centers around the narrator's struggle to overcome the difficulties of a lifetime spent sailing the seas. The poem's overall tone is introspective or reflective. Firstly, fatalism and acceptance. Debate persists among literary scholars whether the seafarer is a monologue or a dialogue between an older seaman and his younger counterpart about sea life's hardships. Either way, a strong sense of melancholy runs through the poem. Although he's fighting for survival, the narrator looks forward to the afterlife since he doesn't expect earthly pleasures to last. Secondly, isolation and loneliness. The predominant theme or subject of The Seafarer is man's struggle against the elements, as highlighted by its numerous references to freezing seas, hailstorms, and jagged cliffs. The desolate feelings invoked are enforced by the narrator's description of his encounters with birds, which remind him poignantly of the community that he's left behind. And thirdly, there is understanding and acceptance. As the seafarer concludes, its mood or tone shifts to accepting that he may prefer the difficulties of the sea life to the falseness and fleeting nature of earthly pomps and joys. The narrator doesn't enjoy his lack of human contact, but also distrusts others. who haven't experienced similar hardships. The cuckoo's call spurs the narrator to continue while reminding him of his isolated status. I've studied few examples of metaphor for this poem. For instance, in line 12 to 17, this, the man does not know for whom on land it turns out most favorably, how I, wretched and sorrowful, on the ice-cold sea, dwelt for a winter in the part of exile, bereft of friendly kinsmen, hung about with icicles, hail flew in showers. Now, the speaker compares a lucky person's knowledge with his own. He's basically stating that most people can never comprehend what he's been through, since they live on a safe, comfortable, cozy land or property. Although we don't know what occurred to the speaker to send him on this unpleasant voyage, he hints that his travels are linked to some type of catastrophe by comparing himself adversely to the happy individual. More winter weather is described in these lines. The water is ice cold. Hail falls and icicles hang from the speaker. That's correct, from the speaker himself. He's metaphorically comparing himself to a building in an odd way. The speaker claims to dwell on exile's paths. He doesn't simply stroll this trail, he also lives there for a while. But what does that actually mean? Exile is a type of expulsion in which you are not permitted to return to your home. So, for whatever reason, this person is living far away, unable to return home. In Anglo-Saxon, the term rendered as paths actually means footsteps. As a result, the speaker is following in the footsteps of others who came before him. This metaphor demonstrates that the life of exile is one that many people before the speaker have had to endure, and it does not sound pleasant.
Now, let us take a look at the setting of the poem The Seafarer. This poem is written in the 10th century of Anglo-Saxon era, and it takes place in the sea. Next, poetic sound devices. There are 3 poetic sound devices in the poem The Seafarer. For alliteration, there are 3 examples. The first one is in line 6, the terrible tossing of waves. The repetition of the letter T is the alliteration in this line. Next is line 7, often sees me at the stem of the ship. The repetition of hot hanging within. The repetition of the letter H is the alliteration. Next, assonance. There are 3 examples of assonance, and the first one is in line 1. I can relate the reality, a song about myself. The repetition of the letter A is the assonance. Second one is in line 2. Go on about the going, how I intoil sometimes. The repetition of the letter O is the assonance. And lastly, in line 4, bitter breast cares have I abated. The repetition of the letter E is the assonance. And lastly, consonants. There are 3 examples of consonants in this poem. First one is in line 3, often under desperate test. The repetition of the letter D is the consonants here. In line 6, where the narrow night watch. The repetition of the letter W is the consonants. And lastly, in line 11, where these sorrows sigh. The repetition of the letter S is the consonants in this line. Next, imagery. Poetic imagery provides sensory details to create clear and vibrant descriptions. This appeals to a reader's imagination and emotions as well as their senses. In this poem, I found three imagery, that is, kinesthetic imagery, tactile imagery, and visual imagery. First, kinesthetic imagery appeals to a reader's sense of motion or movement through describing the sensation of moving or the movement of an object. For example, in line 6, the terrible tossing of waves. It tells that the terrible movement of the waves at that time seems like it will toss everything on it. Second is tactile imagery. It appeals to the sense of touch by describing how something physically feels, such as its temperature, texture, or other sensation. For example, in line 9, oppressed by chills were my feet. This tells that the seafarer is oppressed by the cold weather and his feet numb. The second one is in line 10, bound up by frost with cold chains. This tells that the seafarer is feeling very cold and he is freezing. And the last one is in line 15, ice cold sea. This tells that the weather on the sea is very cold, like the sea was an ice sea. And lastly, visual imagery. It appeals to the sense of sight through the description of color, light, size, pattern, and etc. For example, in line 14, on dry land, the seafarer is describing the land and he is actually comparing to the situation in the sea with the situation on the line. The seafarer is describing the obstacles that he had to endure on the sea, which people on the land would never understand. Next, symbol. There are two symbols that I sort out from this poem. First one is the seafarer. The seafarer symbolizes that the poet is single and he is a solitary figure that describes his own journeys at the sea. Next is exile. Exile in this poem symbolizes that the poet exile is self-imposed, meaning that the poem voluntarily drawn off the vestige of civilized world in search for divine blessings. He undertakes his journey to ensure his entrance into heaven. Since then, he has developed the wisdom that his life is transitory. But somehow, literary critics see that exile is actually representing Adam and his descendants who were cast out of Garden of Eden. In the Bible, the Christian pilgrims who journey to the city of God are exiles. Therefore, the allegorical interpretations draws a parallel between a pilgrim's quest and the seafarer's spiritual journey and voluntary exile. The Seafarer is a 124-line poem written in Old English that scholars often view as a companion piece to The Wanderer. It has an alliterative frenzy. Unlike The Wanderer, it is slightly easier to understand for modern readers because there are fewer vague passages that requires interpretation. This appears to be only one narrator, which is an anhaga, meaning a solitary figure that describes his own journeys at the sea. And then the transitions into a discussion of a ephemerality of life on earth. Some scholars categorize the poem as a lament because of the narrator's suffering. Some consider it is a verse homily because of the preachy tone. Some define it as a wisdom poem due to the narrator's admonition for his readers to trust in the Lord. Meanwhile, some critics believe that the sea journey described in the first half of the poem is actually an allegory, especially because of the poet's use of idiom to express homiletic ideas.